Right, to begin in Afghanistan, where chaos continues at Kabul airport as a large crowd seek to flee Taliban rule. And for more, let's go live to our correspondent Zamrali Abbasin in Kabul. Zamrali, good to see you again. How is the situation in Kabul airport? Is it still chaotic?
Hello and good morning. The situation remains still in Kabul airport while the chaos continues. At the same time, Taliban spokesperson Zabihullah Mujahid yesterday had a press conference, and he mentioned the 31st of August as a deadline and said it's already one-sided and we will not tolerate. And the U.S. has much more capacity along with their allies to evacuate in a week that the time left. Thousands of people are outside Kabul airport, and also thousands more inside the airport, and less than 100,000 people have been evacuated, including the foreigners and Afghans. I also receive reports from the provinces every day, hundreds and sometimes thousands of people reaching out to Kabul to flee the country, seeing the chaos, and they're still afraid of the Taliban, and they were saying that they still cannot believe. But many other believe it was not the situation and there was no Taliban. The people of Afghanistan will evacuate even because of the economic and bad social situation in most of the parts of the country. That's why they will be trying to flee even though they have no documentation, and that's why the crowd is much more in Kabul airport.
Right, and also at the press conference, since you mentioned it, the spokesperson of Taliban also said that Taliban is going to stop Afghan people from going to the airports because they think the chaos there will cause people's deaths. Is that happening already?
No, it's not happening now because I think there was some kind of misinterpretation of those words that Taliban spokesperson Zabihullah Mujahid mentioned. He mean that after 31st of August, they will not let any Afghan to get out of the country, and that's the deadline. They also said that they want the Kabul airport to be normal, and they want the flights get their normal routine. That's why they won't allow the situation to continue the same way, and the chaos, he said, is unbearable. So it's we got almost a week now till 31st of August, and that's what the Taliban spokesperson was mentioning.
Well, after August the 31st, do you think Taliban will stop people from leaving Afghanistan at all, even people with a full travel document?
Well, that's something many believe can be negotiated between Taliban and United States of America, because U.S. Special Representative Zalmay Khalilzad is still on his position as special envoy for the peace. So they will contact, and as I got information from the anonymous resources that didn't want to their name be mentioned, told me that there is already a discussion between Taliban and the U.S. and they want to extend the time because everything came sudden, they believe, and it may take time, and they were not believing that this will happen the way, which will change in a chaos and catastrophe. And they say that there are much more left behind, the Afghans who have worked with U.S. and other foreign missions, and those who are in a bad situation and can be harmed in the future. So these are the situation up to this moment.
Right, and also at the press conference, spokesperson Zabihullah Mujahid also said our security forces, about women's situation there, our security forces are not trained in how to deal with women, how to speak to women for some of them. Until we have a full security in place, we ask women to stay home. How do people in Kabul interpret this, see this? Is it a warning or a ban?
Well, there are discussions about this, particularly between the women and girls that have been working in Afghanistan government and also some private sectors, whether the Taliban have nothing to do with the private sector and companies, but when it comes to the governmental or civil servants, they are strict in this regard. As Zabiullah Mujahid was mentioning this issue, he said that our troops and our soldiers in Kabul city are not well trained. That's why we want to avoid women to join their offices and stay their homes, because it's very early to join the offices, because we don't want them to be harmed. And that seems like the Taliban needs much more time for the women, and particularly to the governmental offices or civil servant organization. So these are the issues still remain unclear, and many still doubt the Taliban stance that they will allow women to work freely.
Right, and about the civil situation in Afghanistan, reports say Taliban have sent a delegation to negotiate with the resistance forces in Panjshir Valley. What more can you tell us about that?
The situation in Panjshir Valley remains still. There is no clash at the moment, because both of the sides are in communication, and they have also exchanged their views, and the resistance too have some precondition which yet not clear, but they say in case these preconditions are solved and the sources close to the resistance also mention these issues, and they will be willing to discuss and negotiate with the Taliban. And the Taliban say, we are just avoiding the war, we have no enmity, and we have positive deeds toward Ahmad Massoud and other resistant forces, and they invite them to work together, but at the same time they say the negotiation continue. And again, Zabiullah Mujahid mentioned the same issues in his presser yesterday, and he also said that the negotiation is hopeful and we are doing our best. Yet Hamid Karzai, former president, and also Dr. Abdullah, who is chief of High Council for National Reconciliation, are still trying with some other elders of Afghanistan, particularly from the northern parts and Panjshir, to make a deal with Ahmad Massoud and Amrullah Saleh to finally end this saga and the bad consequences that this may have, because Panjshir is a strategic and very, very historical valley, and it's hard to fight out there in Panjshir.
All right, thank you very much indeed. Our correspondent Zamarali Abbasin reporting from Kabul. Now, the embassies of many Western countries in Kabul have closed. However, a number of Afghans are still gathering in the diplomatic district, refusing to leave until they receive a visa from their former employers. Some say they feel abandoned by the West. Jawad Temuri in Kabul has more.
Most embassies in Kabul are closed, but some Afghans waiting for visas are still gathering near the embassies and are refusing to leave. Many of them have documents showing they worked for foreign troops or contractors.
I worked for the Canadians for a long time. I came here with my family 5 days ago, but no one has come to receive my visa application form.
I've been here near the German embassy for a week. The gate remains closed and there is no one coming to solve our problems. I've been to the airport before. There were gunshots and the situation was chaotic.
I have tried many ways to get to France. I applied online but received no response.
These Afghans said to me that they used to work for and made contributions to Western countries, but they now feel abandoned in this chaotic situation.
Well, British Prime Minister Boris Johnson says the G7 had agreed on how to deal with the Taliban, with the condition being the group must allow safe passage for Afghans who want to leave the country even after August the 31st. Caroline Malone has more from Washington, D.C.
They didn't get the results they were hoping for. G7 leaders, including France, Britain and Germany, held a video call with the US President Joe Biden as frantic evacuations of their citizens and Afghan allies continue from Kabul. After the meeting, Biden said he's not extending an August 31st deadline to get US troops out of Afghanistan.
We are currently on a pace to finish by August the 31st. The sooner we can finish, the better. Each day of operations brings added risk to our troops. But the completion by August 31st depends upon the Taliban continuing to cooperate.
UK's Prime Minister Boris Johnson and other G7 members had wanted the US to extend the deadline to ensure a level of security to get their own citizens and Afghan allies out on flights. European leaders have also repeatedly emphasised how important it is for the Taliban to let people out, even after the deadline.
The number one condition we're setting as G7 is that they've got to guarantee right the way through August the 31st and beyond, safe passage for those who want to come out. Now, someone will say that they don't accept that, and some of them, I hope, will see the sense of that, because the G7 has very considerable leverage, economic, diplomatic, and political.
G7 leaders also discussed how they'll deal with the Taliban going forward, but there are already concerns over whether the Taliban will respect international relations. From the Taliban's perspective, the US made an agreement to be out by August 31st, and its leaders say if that doesn't happen, the US will face unspecified consequences. US President Biden said they are on track and have already evacuated more than 70,000 people from Kabul since August 14. But there are believed to be thousands more Americans waiting to be airlifted out, as well as many Afghans that want to be evacuated, all with a deadline of 1 week. Caroline Malone, CGTN, Washington.
Well, the head of the UN Human Rights Council says they're receiving reports of violations by the Taliban. Michelle Bachelet warned that the group that it must respect the rights of all Afghan citizens. And earlier we spoke with Lucy Hugh in Brussels about what was said during the Council's emergency session on Afghanistan.
There has been grave concern about the situation in Afghanistan, and a number of envoys expressing the need for the UN to properly monitor the events on the ground. The UN's Human Rights Chief, Michelle Bachelet, spoke of a situation where she described summary executions of civilians, of a serious crackdown on the rights of women and girls who are prevented from accessing their schools, universities and workplaces, as well as the recruitment of child soldiers, all of which, she said, were serious violations of human rights laws. So let's hear from Michelle Bachelet speaking in Geneva earlier.
In particular, we have also received credible reports of serious violation of international humanitarian law and human rights abuses taking place in many areas under effective Taliban control. They include, among others, summary executions of civilians and all the combat members of the Afghan National Security Forces. Restrictions on the right of women, including the right to move around freely and girls' right to attend school. Recruitment of child soldiers and repression of peaceful protests and expression of dissent.
So hearing there from Michelle Bachelet speaking in Geneva, China took a different line. We had an accusation of the US and other Western forces, including Britain and Australia, for their own violations of human rights by military forces operating in Afghanistan over the last few years. Let's hear from China's ambassador to the UN in Geneva, Chen Zhu, speaking to that special session in Geneva.
The facts have once again proven there's no solution using force and military means, and that would only cause serious harm to regional security, stability, and the human rights of the local people. Military forces of the United States, the United Kingdom, and Australia must be held accountable for their violations of human rights in Afghanistan.
This was a draft resolution that was put forward by Pakistan, which declared that the Afghan authorities need to uphold human rights, that there needs to be the protection of the rights of women and girls. But what it failed to do was mention the Taliban by name, and it also failed to conclude that there needs to be an on-the-ground investigation or monitoring operation of the activities of the Taliban on the ground. So this doesn't go nearly far enough as some countries would like. One Western diplomat described the contents of this draft proposal as minimal, saying it was very disappointing. So there will be calls for a tougher statement and a sense that what the UN Human Rights Council managed to produce today is inadequate in contrast with the scale of the humanitarian disaster in Afghanistan.
And now Joseph Gregory Mahoney is joining us from Memphis in the U.S. state of Tennessee. He's a professor of politics at East China Normal University, where he's also the executive director of the International Center for Advanced Political Studies and the director of the International Graduate Program in Politics. Professor, welcome to Global Watch. Biden says he's aiming for the August the 31st deadline, leaving the possibility of extending that date, though. And UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson also says that G7 countries have struck a deal with the Taliban to continue to allow for the safe passage of Afghans after August the 31st. Do you think evacuations of Afghan civilians will be possible?
You know, this still seems to be a fluid negotiation. And while Biden has made it clear that he will try to meet the deadline, he's also equivocated a little bit if you read closely some of the things he said. Both sides have considerable leverage and likewise vulnerabilities. My sense is the Taliban will allow more to leave if the foreign militaries leave on schedule or reduce themselves to much smaller contingents and allow the Taliban to take control of the airport and the evacuation. But we shouldn't be surprised if many who are considered endangered still fail to escape, either because they're blocked by the Taliban or other circumstances.
Right, and the Afghan economy actually is a major concern there, which is dependent on aid. The central bank's funds are inaccessible due to human rights concerns, and the UN is also receiving reports of Taliban abusing human rights, such as summary executions. What will Taliban have to do to improve its international image and ease its economic crisis?
Well, these reports plus the UK proposal we've heard to the G7 that sanctions be considered are some of the key vulnerabilities facing the Taliban presently, encouraging them to allow evacuations to continue and to avoid reprisals as well as reversals on women's rights. Now, as the lead-in reported, the Taliban today said women should stay at home until they train their troops on how to deal with women properly. Understandably, this has received mixed responses overseas. They also said, at least as it was reported throughout the day, that some Afghans would be prevented from leaving because they were necessary for Afghanistan to continue to function and survive. But this also seems to be under negotiation at present. But these are clearly the steps being encouraged and linked to access to aid or possible sanctions.
Right, and again about human rights violations, China's envoy to the UN, Chen Xu, says the US and allied forces need to be held accountable for their human rights violations in Afghanistan. And those who suffered under the West's long military occupation in Afghanistan likely to get justice or even hear an apology. Do you think that could be possible?
You know, I think the general impression that's been created by Biden especially is that the U.S. was incredibly generous and the Afghans themselves are responsible for this outcome, that they squandered America's gifts and chose the Taliban. And while many are disgusted with the ongoing catastrophe, the broader consensus in the U.S. is that the Americans should leave as quickly as possible and wash their hands when they get home. So no, despite numerous failed policies that left hundreds of thousands dead and a country again on the brink, I don't think we'll see any atonement whatsoever from the U.S.
That's sad, isn't it? Thank you very much, Professor Joseph Gregory Mahoney from of Politics at East China Normal University. Thank you very much for joining us.